I liked this quite a bit more than some of the other Nolan projects. Whilst I did really enjoy Oppenheimer and would probably give it a higher score than this film, I think that Nolan really gets the scale of this story. The journey that Odysseus goes on feels very long and very arduous, fraught with danger. There's a real sense that you don't know what's going to be on each island because there's magic involved. The movie opens with a title card of "In a Time of Apparent Magic," which I do find to be very interesting. It does seem that some characters have magical powers and that the gods are real, but there are also parts of this movie where the characters are blaming the gods for their fortune or misfortune, citing them as a reason why the plot events are occurring, when actually that may not be the case, and that is something that is very interesting about this film. You don't know what is natural and what may be magic or related to the gods. This world doesn't really feel like a historical one, which is going to do a lot of the heavy lifting when seeing some things that might break my immersion, such as an ethnically Indian or Korean Ithacan. Not really sure how that's supposed to happen, but this world isn't really history, it's mythological, and so I like the ambiguous nature of it all, the ambiguous geography. So overall, I was quite surprised by how the story was adapted into a film. There are some things that I would have liked to have seen that were not included, which is a shame, but I think if you had no idea what the Odyssey was, no idea about Homer or the source material, you would be able to enjoy this movie a lot more without any of the nitpicks that I'm going to bring up, which mainly consist of scenes that I would have liked to have seen that weren't included. I think there's a lot of great casting in this film. Matt Damon as Odysseus is really great, Tom Holland is a good Telemachus, and Anne Hathaway as Penelope is the standout from this film. She is totally stealing every scene that she's in, and the non-linear storytelling in the Odyssey is preserved in this film, and I think it really suits Nolan's sensibilities as a filmmaker. He's able to tell this overarching story which links separate plot lines together, and I think he does that well. One of the things that makes this quite difficult to adapt is how confusing the story can be in terms of the order of events and how many events there are to try and fit into a 2.5 or 3 hour film. And I think bringing in these other storylines helps break up Odysseus's Odyssey plot, the main plot, from simply being going from one island and then escaping to go to another island and then another island. The multiple storylines really helps the pacing of that out. Before I get into some of the plot events, I think it's important to talk about the character of Odysseus in the original text. Odysseus is a Greek hero, and as I understand it, the idea behind a Greek hero is different to our modern interpretations of what a hero's journey is. In Greek mythology, we do not root for Odysseus because he is necessarily a good person, but we are enthralled by him, we are drawn to him, we cannot help but look at him. Even when he makes catastrophic decisions, even decisions that we don't like, we can't help but watch. And so going into this film, I knew of many things that would make Odysseus very difficult to relate to as a modern day hero, because he does commit very heinous acts in the original text. It's all to be interpreted within the context of ancient Greece, of course, but certainly from modern standards, and even by those standards then. Odysseus was not necessarily a good man and makes many decisions that harms others intentionally and unintentionally. And so I was wondering whether or not Nolan was going to include those aspects of Odysseus's past or his actions throughout the story that make him a very grey figure, not one that we would necessarily want to root for. I like the idea of coming out of the story and maybe half the audience think that he's a good person, or tries to be, and half the audience think that he's not. For example, after the sacking of Troy, it's said that Odysseus and his men enslave the women and children of Troy, and they share the riches of the women equally between them. Now, it's up for interpretation exactly what is meant by that, but it probably isn't good for those women, because even in the original text, what happens to those women is never stated. We do not know. And so one of my big questions going into this is, what is Nolan going to do about that? Is he just going to ignore that, which was the most likely option and what he ultimately did? And there is a benefit to ignoring that, because it means that you don't have your main character doing something early on in the story that is going to alienate a lot of the audience. But on the other hand, it's not very faithful to what we know this character to have done in the original story, and is somewhat somewhat forsaking the idea of the Greek hero in favor of the modern one, because his other option is to show that straight away, and that may mean that people are not so invested in Odysseus' success returning home, especially when you consider that even though that fact of what he seemingly does to those women is in the original story is very monogamous and focused on his return to his wife Penelope. And if you show him committing heinous acts towards other women, or sharing a bed with Circe, or even Calypso, even though that is supposed to be against his will, when he's meant to be motivated to come home to his wife, who is his single love, that creates a conflict in the audience and might make it more difficult to enjoy the movie. I personally am in favor of showing Odysseus to be quite terrible. I don't really need him to be a good person. I'm quite interested in how he's presented in the original, this very arrogant man who we can't help but watch. I think that's more interesting to me than like a gladiator-style Russell Crowe hero's journey, which is kind of like what this movie is a bit, but the Odyssey is a bit better than Gladiator, I think. So one of the first places Odysseus ends up is at the island with the Cyclops. Now, I don't really know how they achieved the Cyclops effect without using CGI or very much. I have seen some behind-the-scenes production stills, and I don't really know what they've done, but it does look very good. And I like that they preserved that the Cyclops eats people. There's a lot of darkness and quite disturbing things in the original story that I wasn't sure they were going to preserve when adapting this for film and for a general audience, that actually they have remained pretty loyal to, but I'll get into the specific details a bit later. And so I do like that whole sequence. In the original, the reason that Odysseus becomes cursed is of course because he has harmed this Cyclops, but it's actually because he declares his full name and where he's from to the Cyclops as he's escaping. And it's because the Cyclops knows his name that he's able to put that curse on him. That is different from what happens in this film. It seems that Odysseus is cursed simply because he attacked the son of Poseidon, who is the Cyclops. And in order to escape, Odysseus was always going to have to do that. He did end up in that position because he was being very arrogant, and he helps himself to the Cyclops' cheese and says he's going to welcome back the owner after they've effectively just stolen from them. But it's not as explicit in this story than in the original. And in that original, in order to get that curse, the curse is like a punishment of Odysseus' own arrogance. Because he is so full of himself, he reveals his name to gloat to this person. And the punishment for that is that he is cursed on the seas. The whole thing is relating to this idea of Zeus's law, which surprisingly is very explored throughout this film in granting strangers hospitality and the suitor's hospitality in Odysseus' home while he's away. And there's a lot of exploration into you have to treat people the way you would want to be treated because you don't know if they're going to be a god in disguise. And that is effectively what happens with the Cyclops. He doesn't know that the Cyclops is the son of Poseidon, the sea god. If he did know that, he'd probably be more careful about what he says to him and how he treats him. But Nolan doesn't link this idea of Zeus's law with what happens to the Cyclops. Odysseus is cursed out of bad luck, and again we're abstracting responsibility away from him by minimizing his arrogant choices. You know, all he did was take some cheese and now he's cursed forever. And so I think not having that confrontation does lose something from the story. And there's quite a bit of this in the film where we make other characters do things that make Odysseus look quite good in order for the audience to relate to this character more easily, even though he is, by the standards of the original text, as guilty as anyone else of those things. But the movie does treat him as if he has a slightly different moral high ground than maybe the other soldiers, when actually what the message should be, and what the lesson that Odysseus should learn from that encounter, is that he has to be more humble, and unless he learns humility, he will not make it back home. And that's not really what happens in this film. I guess you could say that Odysseus is being humble when he's disguising himself as a beggar, but it is a bit of a push. He's really just following Agamemnon's advice, and what initiates Odysseus to be able to get home is just him finding his mojo again and reactivating his will and determination. And whilst I think that Matt Damon was well cast for Odysseus, and certainly the characterization of Odysseus in this film, I think that characterization is the problem here. What does Odysseus learn throughout this story? Well, he learns a bit of humility, but that is secondary to what he actually learns and reflects on at the end of the film, which is that he reflects on his underhanded tactics to win the Trojan War. His realization at the end of the film isn't really that he has to be more humble, because he was never really arrogant in the first place. It's instead that he didn't treat his fellow people with dignity and respect. He slaughtered them at night in their home after he lied to them, took advantage of their hospitality, disenfranchised the gods. I think it's interesting to explore that you may feel bad about that, but he also ended a 10-year war. You can rationalize your way out of it, so whilst there is merit in exploring his shame about his actions in conflict, that does seem to be the primary takeaway, and I'm left thinking, what is the message here? Is it to be anti-war, or at least to fight wars in accordance with the Geneva Convention? I don't really know. And the reason we have this problem is because Odysseus never really learns humility, because he's never really arrogant. There are many interactions that Odysseus has in the original text where he is over the top. He is boasting, playing with people's lives, very arrogant about being a great warrior, a great general, being extremely cunning, able to outsmart anyone. The story should be about him learning humility when confronted with what the consequences, the negative consequences of those traits are, the effect they have on him, delaying his return home, resulting in the deaths of many of his men. I feel like Odysseus should be reflecting on how his actions cause his own men to suffer and his own family. And then you can obviously include what happened to the Trojans in that as well. But this is not Odysseus's character journey in the movie, and that is a fundamental problem. The character is like a typical Nolan protagonist, never showing any emotion, never showing any kind of struggle or reflection until the very end. Odysseus is a stoic. He doesn't show any emotion here, and he really should be. It's his high emotions that cause so many of the problems in this story. But again, we minimize, we abstract away, we make it so that Odysseus is as likable as possible, and that is not serving this story. There were some other parts of the film I was expecting to see that I didn't. There was no Island of the Lotus Eaters. Instead, we had Calypso using the lotus flower to keep Odysseus on Calypso's island. So that's our substitute for that, instead of getting the Island of the Lotus Eaters, which, if I remember rightly, is the first place that Odysseus and his men arrive at. I do feel like Calypso has been slightly misinterpreted. Odysseus is meant to be with Calypso against his will, and again, this would be a great opportunity for him to reflect on his actions over 7 years. Being forced to do whatever act Calypso wants is a really terrible fate. He has no control over this. But instead of spending 7 years suffering, the film has changed this story to remove his agency, give him the lotus flower, dull his mind. The reason Odysseus couldn't go back home is because he wasn't thinking about it. And as soon as he started thinking about his family again, he was all good. In both cases, Odysseus is helpless, but in the film, he's helpless to struggle against his situation, whereas he is in the original text, which would allow us in the film, if we were adapting this properly, to explore those ideas of shame and allow Odysseus to reevaluate what his goals are in this story. Talking about the rest of the sequences, I thought the Scylla scene was underwhelming. We never really got a good look at Scylla. It didn't look like Scylla had a humanoid part, a female part. Scylla isn't always represented as a woman, but I could hardly even see what Scylla was. Like, what are these arms that are just grabbing the people? I know they're meant to be snake heads, but they kind of look like elephant trunks. It was a bit underwhelming. I thought that the scene where they slaughtered the sheep to talk to the dead in Hades was actually a very good scene, very effective. One of the ones that I was anticipating would translate to film very well. My only complaint about that scene is that we didn't have some of the other warlords talking to Odysseus or refusing to talk to him that you have in the original. and we didn't have Odysseus seeing his dead mother and then him trying to embrace her 3 times but being unable to as she's only an apparition. I think those inclusions wouldn't have taken much time, but they would have been very appreciated by me in that scene. The Lystrogonians were pretty cool. I enjoyed that. I think it's quite cool to interpret them as these giant knights. The only thing we didn't see is that they eat humans in the original, and we don't see any of that in this film. Granted, it would be difficult to do because Odysseus and his men escape, but some sort of acknowledgement of that would have been great. Agamemnon too looks really great throughout this whole film. His armor, aura farming, just straight up aura farming the whole film. Hardly even says anything, just stands there and looks cool. The scene where Circe is transforming the men into pigs is a really cool and disturbing scene. One of my favorites in this film. That was really great. Absolutely loved that. I heard it's practical, so I don't really know exactly what they were doing there, but absolutely loved that. Again, it's a bit strange because he should be staying there for a year, she should be seducing him, but they changed that for some reason. Probably just because it starts complicating things if Odysseus, by choice, even if he is seduced, gets with Circe, and then Calypso, when he should be trying to remain faithful to Penelope, it just gets complicated. But the sequence on that island was really great. And I think in the end, the weakest part of this film is the ending. It's very strange. Odysseus is reflective on how he's treated others in combat, and then his final act in the movie is to just kill everyone in his house, which doesn't seem to be particularly different from how he acted back in Troy, the thing that he seemingly regrets. And seeing one man take on an entire room of like 100 or more people, it wasn't very realistic, and he's an old man. I just didn't really buy into it. And then I couldn't really tell if it was meant to be funny because Robert Pattinson, every time a new weapon fell through the ceiling, was just shouting the name of the weapon, which I did find funny, but I'm like, am I supposed to? Just seemed very weird to me. I did like the detail about when Odysseus sees Athena, the shape that Athena has taken on is the shape of a woman who looks identical to a woman who was executed in Troy. And during some of the flashbacks, we do see just how destructive the sacking of Troy really was, and I do actually appreciate that. Even if it doesn't tie into the overall story and messaging very well, acknowledging the brutality of the sacking is very welcome. And again, we have this minimization of Odysseus's actions because even during that sacking, especially once the army come in, he doesn't really do anything. Like, we're not really seeing him commit terrible acts. We see that he's responsible for it and he's reflective in that moment. But maybe it would make more sense to have him be more active in that sacking to allow him to be reflective later rather than being reflective immediately, because if he's reflective straight away, what is the journey? What is the arc he's on? So I've complained about a lot of things because I would have liked to have seen many more things included into this film, and I'm not really sure why they decided to include some stuff if they weren't going to include it fully or properly. But overall, I do think the adaptation of the plot events is very good. I'm not so convinced about the overall story. What is the message of this film? What is the character journey that Odysseus goes on? It's very vague and, quite frankly, unfaithful to the original. So even with all those complaints, I will still give the movie 4 stars out of 5. 4 stars out.